Margaret Truman was born into presidential history, the only daughter of Harry S. Truman and Bess Truman. She didn't just sit quietly in the shadows of the White House. No, she sang, wrote bestsellers, hosted her own radio shows, and even became a mystery novelist who made Washington, D.C. her murder playground. So how did this president's daughter go from soprano soloist to true crime sensation? This is the full story of Margaret Truman, a woman whose life was anything but ordinary. Margaret Truman was born on February 17, 1924, in Independence, Missouri. She was named Mary Margaret in honor of her aunt and her maternal grandmother. Her early years were rooted in small-town life until her father was elected to the U.S. Senate. From 1935 onward, her life split between Missouri and Washington, D.C. During the school year, she bounced back and forth between public schools in Independence and the elite Gunston Hall in D.C. By the time she graduated high school in 1942, the world was at war, and her father's political star was on the rise. She enrolled at George Washington University, earning an Associate of Arts in 1944, the same year her dad became vice president. 2 years later, in 1946, she received her bachelor's in history. And guess who handed her diploma on stage? Her dad, also known as the President of the United States. At 16, she began voice lessons back home in Independence. By 1947, she was making her concert debut with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, and that same year, she sang at the Hollywood Bowl in front of 20,000 people. Her first national concert tour began in 1947 and took her to Constitution Hall, where her parents finally heard her sing in public. In 1949, she sang at Carnegie Hall, a milestone for any performer. That same year, she performed with the National Symphony Orchestra in D.C. Margaret Truman, soprano, was now a national name. But fame came with friction. Critics weren't always kind. Some said her career got a boost because of her last name. One particularly harsh review reportedly enraged President Truman so much, he wrote a scathing letter threatening to punch the critic in the nose. Despite the pressure, Margaret kept performing, studying with top-tier voice coaches like Helen Traubel and Sidney Ditch. She even appeared on Ed Sullivan's Toast of the Town in 1950. Still, by the mid-1950s, the music world lost her to something else: storytelling. As her concert career cooled, Margaret pivoted to broadcasting. In 1951, she signed with NBC and moved to New York. She hosted radio shows like Weekday and made television appearances, including a rare moment interviewing her own parents on live TV in 1955. The segment was broadcast as part of Edward R. Murrow's Person to Person. She wasn't just a celebrity host. She was genuinely good at what she did, natural, curious, and sharp. In the 60s, she hosted Authors in the News, interviewing top writers for a daily 5-minute radio program broadcast on more than 100 stations. That's not something you coast through on name recognition alone. In 1955, Margaret met E. Clifton Daniel, a journalist with the New York Times. They married the next year in Independence, Missouri, in a modest Episcopal ceremony. Clifton later became chief of the Times Washington Bureau, and together they had 4 sons: Clifton Truman Daniel, born 1957, William Wallace Daniel, born 1959, Harrison Gates Daniel, born 1963, Thomas Washington Daniel, born 1966. They had 5 grandchildren, and despite their demanding careers, the Daniels kept a relatively private family life. After her father left the White House in 1953, Margaret and Clifton moved to New York, where they stayed for most of their lives, except for a stint back in D.C. in the 70s when Clifton returned to Washington. Tragically, Margaret's son William died in 2000 at age 41. Her husband, Clifton, passed away that same year. It was in her writing that Margaret really made her mark. Her first book was Souvenir, Margaret Truman's Own Story, 1956, a memoir. But that was just the beginning. In 1969, she wrote White House Pets, a charming nonfiction book. She followed that with Women of Courage, 1976, and a full biography of her father, Harry S. Truman, 1973. Later, she penned Bess W. Truman, 1986, honoring her famously private mother. But the real twist? Margaret Truman became one of America's best-selling mystery writers. It all started with Murder in the White House in 1980, a political thriller that drew on her deep knowledge of Washington's inner workings. It was a hit. She followed it up with over 25 more books in her Capital Crimes series. Murder on Capitol Hill, 1981. Murder in the Supreme Court, 1982. Murder at the National Cathedral, 1990. Murder at the Pentagon, 1992. Murder at Union Station, 2004. And so many more. Her murder mysteries took readers deep into the iconic halls of Washington, from Ford's Theater to the Library of Congress. She used her insider knowledge and spun gripping tales that were part whodunit, part political drama. Later in life, she collaborated with ghostwriters, but her vision and branding stayed strong. The books kept selling. Margaret never let her father's memory fade. She served as secretary to the board of the Harry S. Truman Scholarship Foundation and was on the board of the Truman Library Institute. In 1983 and 1984, she helped lead the Truman Centennial celebrations, marking what would have been her father's 100th birthday. She was awarded the 1984 Harry S. Truman Public Service Award, a recognition that likely meant more than most. She also edited deeply personal collections of her father's writings, Letters from Father, 1981, Where the Buck Stops, 1989. Through those works, we saw a different Harry Truman, not just the president, but the dad, the man who worried, joked, and gave advice in his own blunt style. Margaret Truman. Daniel spent her later years continuing to write, speak, and advocate for the causes she believed in. She remained a force in the literary world and a link to one of America's most consequential presidencies. She died in Chicago on January 29, 2008, at the age of 83. Her ashes were interred alongside her husband and parents at the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. Margaret Truman was many things: first daughter, performer, journalist, author, wife, mother, historian. But above all, she was her father's daughter, and one of the most quietly influential women